When we think about history, our minds usually jump to the big, loud characters, right? The famous conquerors, the brilliant inventors, the ones who really made a scene. But sometimes, the most powerful stories belong to the quiet figures, the ones who stood right in between the titans. Today, we're going to look at one of those exact figures from Korea's Joseon dynasty.
So let's start with this. This quote really gets to the very heart of King Munjong. He wasn't about big, flashy gestures. Nope, he was all about quiet, solid competence. He was a king whose depth, well, it was just so much greater than the short time he was actually given to rule.
To really get Munjong, you have to understand who he was sandwiched between. I mean, look at this. On one side, you've got his father, the absolute legend, King Sejong the Great, the genius behind the Korean alphabet. And on the other side, his ambitious younger brother, who would become the ruthless King Sejo. Munjong is that critical and honestly often forgotten bridge between these two giants.
Right, so this is really the story of that in-between king. A man who spent his life standing quietly in the shadow of a brilliant father and directly in the path of a brother who wanted power more than anything.
Okay, so Munjong was born into some serious pressure. His grandfather was the fearsome King Taejong, a man who literally waded through blood to get the throne. But his father, Sejong, was the total opposite, a scholar king completely devoted to his people. Munjong grew up in that mix, a quiet, bookish kid watching one of the greatest rulers in history. And then, at just 8 years old, bam, the weight of the world is put right on his shoulders. He's named Crown Prince.
And that brings us to what really defined his life before he ever wore the crown: the wait. I mean, his apprenticeship to be king, it wasn't a sprint. It was an absolute marathon.
29 years. Just let that number sink in. For nearly 3 whole decades, he was the king in waiting. That is the longest of anyone in the entire 500-year history of the dynasty. Think about that. He spent more of his adult life preparing to be king than he ever actually was king.
And believe me, those 29 years were rough. He suffered some profound personal tragedies. His first 2 marriages just fell apart in scandal, forcing his wives out of the palace. He finally finds what seems like real happiness with his 3rd wife, only for her to die just 1 day after giving birth to a son and heir. But through all that, he proved himself. As his father Sejong's health got worse, Munjong stepped up, basically running the country as regent for 5 years. He wasn't just waiting around, he was already governing, and he was doing a great job.
So in 1450, after that incredibly long, painful wait, his time finally came. The student became the master. King Sejong passed away, and Munjong, now 37 years old, finally took the throne. And man, did he hit the ground running. He didn't just try to copy his dad, he built on his legacy, and he found this perfect balance. He finished his father's massive historical project, the history of Goryeo, but at the same time, he was beefing up the military with things like the Hwacha, which was basically this awesome ancient rocket arrow launcher. He was a master of both Moon, scholarship, and Mu, warfare. The real deal.
His leadership style was also pretty special. He wasn't some tyrant who just barked orders. He actually became known as the listening king. He'd get his officials together, let every single person make their case, and only after he'd heard all sides would he make a calm, thoughtful decision. His rule was built on respect and intelligence, not on fear.
On top of all that, Munjong was a really gifted artist. He was known for painting bamboo, and in East Asian culture, bamboo is this huge symbol of integrity and resilience. It bends in the wind, but it doesn't break. When you think about all the tragedy and that long wait he had to endure, it almost feels like he wasn't just painting bamboo, he was painting a self-portrait.
But there was a shadow hanging over his very promising reign. 2, actually. 2 dark clouds that he just couldn't escape: his own failing health and this deep, nagging fear for his young son's future.
Munjong was just never a healthy guy. From a young age, he was always sick, dealing with chronic illnesses and these painful sores. And the unbelievable stress of running an entire country, it just made everything so much worse. The clock was ticking, and he knew it. So let's just get real for a second. Forget the crown, forget the palace. What does any dying father, who also happens to be a king, fear more than anything else? Well, yeah, of course there's the fear of his own death, the fear of leaving all his work unfinished. That's a given. But his greatest fear, the thing that must have kept him up at night, was for his son, Danjung. The boy was only 12. He had no mother. And Munjong knew that a boy king in a court filled with ambitious men, including his very own brother, was like a lamb surrounded by wolves.
And that fear, well, it would become his legacy. Because what happened after Munjong died is one of the most brutal and tragic chapters in all of Joseon history, and it all went down with terrifying speed. He waited 29 years for the throne, and he got to sit on it for just 2 years and 3 months. A whole lifetime of preparation for a reign that was over in a blink.
And just 5 years after Munjong took his last breath, his absolute worst nightmare came true. His beloved son, the little boy he tried so hard to protect, was dead.
It was just a swift, calculated takedown. Munjong dies in 1452. The very next year, his brother launches a bloody coup, killing the very officials Munjong had put in place to protect his son. By 1455, he's forced his own nephew to give up the throne. And just 2 years after that, to make sure there were no loose ends, he has the young, exiled Danjong killed. He was just 17 years old.
And so, this is how history remembers him. Not as a failure, but as the virtuous king of misfortune. He had all the qualities of a truly great ruler, the wisdom, the work ethic, the compassion. He had everything. Everything except time.
Which leaves us with the ultimate haunting question. What if? What if his health had just held on for a little longer? What if he had lived just 10 more years? His son would have grown up, the throne would have been secure, and the entire history of Korea might have gone down a different path. We'll never know, of course, but it's that tragic what if that makes the story of King Munjong so unforgettable.